Alright guys, so welcome back to the man cave. I had a request to do some tool maintenance stuff as a video, and so we're going to walk through a few things with tool maintenance. The first thing that I want to talk about is hammers, and I want to talk about the way that a hammer is put together. So the handle slips through the hammer in this direction. And then up here in the top, we use these wedges to spread this top out so it holds it solid in place. These hammer heads can get really dangerous if they start getting loose. They also get really dangerous if they start getting excessively broken in this area. I don't know that you realize how much force you actually put when you swing a hammer. This hammer head goes flying and it could cause some significant problems. Now, my hammers are in pretty good shape. There's a couple of things that we need to inspect on a hammer. First of all, this head right here on the hammer needs to be rounded. If this hammer starts to get a little bit loose, the best way to tighten a hammer up is to take another hammer and hit the end of the handle just like that, and it will slide it forward, and then you can drive this wedge down into the hammer end and it will tighten that up. You need to make sure that your handles are in good shape when you're using your hammers, and you need to make sure that you don't have mushrooming on the hammer head, because if it starts to mushroom, that mushroomed piece can come flying off and cause some serious injury. Now we're going to move on to files. A file needs to be kept clean. I keep mine in a sheath. That way, the file stays in good condition. These files have a tendency to try and gather a little bit of rust. And we don't want to use oil on them very bad, because that also affects the way a file reacts. So we need to make sure that we keep our teeth on our file nice and sharp. If they start to get dull, you'll just need to replace the file. Now, one of the things that you can do to help keep a file from becoming dull is to not pull back on the file with pressure down. If you're only pushing forward and lift up and push forward, your file will tend to stay sharp longer. Okay, so now we're going to talk about chisels a little bit. Now this is a wood chisel that I use for doing some woodworking stuff. And you can see that the end of it has kind of been chipped up. And that comes from hitting hard objects instead of wood. Now the way that I'm going to fix this is I'm going to take a file and I'm going to try to maintain the same angle here, and I'm going to file this end back. And I'm going to do most of my filing from this one side. And I'm going to try and keep the edge of this straight. And then I'm going to turn this over and I'm going to take just a little bit off of this back so that I don't have anything sticking out. Now I'm not going to complete this one. This is going to take a lot more work. Now these files should be really sharp, and they should be kept in a sheath that protects the end from getting damaged. Now we're going to talk about punches and chisels. Now, in the hammer part, I talked about this mushrooming on the end of a hammer. It also happens on the end of a chisel or a punch. Now this, when it starts to happen, that piece right there, when you strike this with a hammer, can come flying off and stick in your finger or your leg or your eyeball or some other place that it's not supposed to be. Now, we want to make sure that we don't apply very much heat to the end of this chisel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my bench grinder, and I'm going to very lightly turn that end down, and I'm not going to turn it for very long. I'm going to make sure that it stays cool. And I'm going to do that a few times until I get a nice beveled surface. Now on this end, this has been chipped a few times. So I am going to do basically the same thing. Going to very gently run that along there. Make sure that it stays cool. And then I am going to flatten the end of this. And I'm going to do that just a little bit, and then I will come back and do some more. I'm going to let this cool really good in between. And then we'll be able to get this end nice and smooth so that it won't have any edges that will fly off. Now we're going to do the same thing with the chisel. We're going to take this edge off where it's mushroomed out a little bit. We are also going to fix this gouge right here that's on the end of this chisel. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this on my grinder. I'm going to maintain the same angle, and I'm going to work across it really quickly. Other side, cross it really quickly, and then I'm going to let that set for just a little while. Make sure it's cooled off. Again, both sides, until I get this so that it is nice and straight all the way across. Oh, and still got just a little bit of a nick in it right there, but I'm going to leave it for right now. Now we're going to talk about screwdrivers. This is a standard screwdriver. This is one that I found. You can tell by looking at it that it's not one of my regular screwdrivers. It is something that I picked up. However, I am going to show you a couple of things about a standard screwdriver that will help you to keep from breaking screws and from saying bad words. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about this very end of this screwdriver. Now if you look at this one, somebody has taken this to a grinder. You can see right there that it has got hot. Okay? But what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we stay away from getting this hot. You can also see that they have fixed the end of this screwdriver by taking it to a grinder and making it sharp. Now, I want you to think about this. If we take the head of a screw and it has a slot cut in it, and we take a screwdriver that is sharp like this and then try and twist that, the tendency is for this screwdriver to try and push up. As we push down on this, it's going to try and separate the screw and the screwdriver. So, what we want to do instead is have the end of our screwdriver so that it is more rounded so that it tries to hold itself in place. Now I'm going to show you how we're going to do that. The first thing that I am going to do is I'm going to take this screwdriver and I'm going to take the end of it and I am going to run it to the flat position. I want it straight and I want it flat. And you want to try and apply not very much pressure, and you want to move the workpiece fairly quickly. Now if you look at this, you can see that I have this end flat. Now what I am going to do is I'm going to take this screwdriver and I'm going to hold it up higher on this wheel, and I'm going to just touch it down to the grinding wheel and move it across. I'm going to do the other side the same way. Now, what is happening is we're actually grinding back in this area first instead of up here. So it's actually going to get narrower behind where the end is than it is right at the head. And it takes some practice to be able to do this. Now, instead of having a pointed end, I have an end that is more beveled. That will try and hold itself in the screw much better. Now we are going to talk about a Phillips screwdriver. Now, these can be redressed up, but they need to be, it's fairly difficult to do. Typically, a screwdriver is not expensive enough to try and salvage one of these. If you are going to, one of the things that you need to remember is it needs to have a flat end. Okay, you don't want this to be sharp, because if this is sharp, it's going to try and climb out of the screw, just like with the regular screwdriver that we talked about. Drill bits need to be kept sharp. If you look at the end of this drill bit, you can see that it's got a gouge in it right there on this corner. These can be cleaned up with a grinder, but they also make some drill bit sharpening tools that work really well. Learning how to sharpen a drill bit takes a lot of practice. What you have to do is you have to make sure that you keep this point in the center of the screw or the drill, and you have to make sure that you keep the angle coming away so that it's cutting material instead of jumping on the material. I'm not going to show you how to do this, but you need to be aware that there are drill bit sharpening tools that work really well, and your drill bits need to be sharp. This is what typically happens with a dull drill bit when you're trying to force it. You can see that a drill bit in the fluted area is not very thick, and so they break pretty easily. And this usually comes from a dull drill bit and excessive pressure. So we're going to talk about end wrenches. And we're just going to talk about the basic maintenance of end wrenches. Now, before you put your wrenches away, you want to just make sure that they're clean, because dirty wrenches are just much more difficult to deal with, and clean wrenches just last longer. They have a tendency to resist rust a lot better. So I always wipe my wrenches down, and then I keep my wrenches very organized. This way I can look in my toolbox and know what is missing. So this is an adjustable wrench. This wrench, you turn this screw right here and it moves the end of this wrench. Now these, if you let them get into moisture very much, they will start to rust in this area. So if that happens, what you're going to want to do is spray just a little bit of a penetrating lubricant right in this area, and then you'll want to work this back and forth, work it all the way into the end and all the way out to the end. You'll want to do that a couple of times until everything moves freely. Now sometimes you also want to put a little bit right down in this moving area right here, and do the same thing. Move it back and forth so that it moves freely. When I get done doing this, what I am going to do is I am going to then wipe this wrench down so that it doesn't have oil all over it, but it does resist rust and it moves freely. Same thing with the pipe wrench. We sometimes need to put a little lubricant on the area where this wheel or nut moves on these threads, and then work it all the way back and all the way forward. Now on a pipe wrench, you also want to make sure that your teeth on your pipe wrench are nice and sharp. That way they can bite into the object that you are working on, and you don't just slip and hurt your knuckles. So we're going to talk about organizing our sockets. So I bought these at Harbor Freight, and they've got the numbers on them. And I put my deep sockets on one side and my shallow sockets on the other side, and it gives me good organization. Now, of course, with this socket set, I don't have this 5/8 socket, so I have used this to store my swivel and a socket that I didn't have a spot for on that end. Anyways, this keeps it organized, and if I look in my toolbox and I see something missing, it tells me exactly what I'm missing so that I can look for that specific tool. So one of the things that happens with good tool maintenance is also good tool storage practices. In a shop, there is a place for everything, and everything has its place. When you get done using a tool, you simply put it back in its place. This way we keep track of our stuff. So we're going to talk about ratchets. Now this is a swivel head ratchet. A ratchet gives you the ability to move things one direction and spin it freely in the other direction. Now this is a fairly cheap ratchet. It does have a kit that you can put back in it to rebuild. You need to remove this snap ring right here, and this entire piece comes sliding out. And then you replace this piece and slide it back in, so it is a repairable ratchet. This is a little bit more expensive ratchet, but again, in order to repair this ratchet, what you have to do is you have to go in here and remove this snap ring right here and pull this entire piece out, and then the entire piece has to go back in. This one is kind of difficult to rebuild. This ratchet is an expensive ratchet, and this ratchet comes apart right here. You take these two screws out, this entire piece comes out, and you can replace this piece right here, and you can replace the entire assembly, or you can simply replace parts of this assembly. These ratchets are they're more expensive, but they are definitely nicer. Now we're going to talk about a torque wrench. Now a torque wrench, what a torque wrench does is it gives us the ability to measure the tension that we put on a bolt. Now a torque wrench has a scale on the side of it that we line up with this scale that runs around this handle. We do that by twisting the handle. So as we twist the handle, it moves up on this scale, and we start to get our numbers, and then it locks in place. A torque wrench has a spring. One of these clicking type torque wrenches has a spring inside of it, and that spring changes at what point this thing clicks. And that click tells us when we've reached our tension or the amount of pressure that we put on a bolt. Now, if that spring is stored under pressure, over time it will begin to lose its spring a little bit. So when you store a torque wrench, you always want to back the handle all the way off so that the spring is not under pressure. All right, so we're going to talk about some pliers and some cutting tools, and then we're going to talk about rusty tools, and I'm just going to mix this kind of all into one thing. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is a pair of tin snips or cutting pliers. Now, the edge of this right here needs to stay very sharp in order for these to work accurately. And you can sharpen these with a file, but it takes a lot of practice. If you're going to, the easiest way to sharpen this is to actually take it apart and use a file and sharpen these ends. And you'll want to try and follow the same grooves that they had at the factory. These are an old rusty pair of slip joint pliers that I found on the side of a road several years ago. And I have continued to use them for odds and ends. They are not super good pliers. You can see that they have quite a bit of play in them. However, I use them occasionally. Now, what we want to do with this plier, it's rusty, and so what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to put a little bit of this lubricant right here at the pivot point, and a little bit between the two pieces. And then we'll move that back and forth, and I'm just going to let that set for a while. Now we're going to take a pair of tongue and groove pliers that have been sitting out, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to spray a little bit of lubricant on the grooves as well as on the tongue part of these pliers. We're also going to put just a little bit up in here where this pivots, and then we're going to work these pliers back and forth and all the way around, and we're just going to work them around a bit. We'll continue to work those. I'll just let them set for now. This is a pair of diagonal cutters that I found, and you can see that they kind of set out somewhere. And so what I'm going to do with these is, if you look at them, you can see that this piece spins on this piece. And then we have a tight fit right in here and right in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray both of these ends. And I'm going to spray some of them in here on the top, and then I'm just going to work this back and forth. Now, I could clean these pliers up really good, but I don't really think that I need to for these pliers because I have a lot of pliers. I probably should learn to not pick them up anymore, but I can't really learn that either. So with the diagonal cutter, if this cutting edge starts to get chipped up and starts to get chips and gouges in it, you can clean these up with a file, and it takes a little practice. I've cleaned them up before. If I have a good set of pliers, I will clean them up, but I usually won't mess with a cheap set of pliers for very long. The next thing that we need to understand when we're talking about tools is that everything needs to have a place. In order for you to work efficiently, you need to keep your shop organized. When you get done with the day, you need to spend a little time putting all of your tools away and making sure that they're clean. This makes you much more productive, much more efficient, and happier. So I keep my ratchets out here where I can get to them really easily. Just because that's the way I like to do things. Now, I want to talk a little bit about tools. There are tools that are very expensive, and there are tools that are very cheap. Now, with me, I have some of each. I have some tools that I bought at Harbor Freight. I have some tools that I picked up in a pawn shop. I have tools that I've bought at a yard sale. And then I have tools that I bought off of a tool truck. The tools that I bought off of a tool truck are typically going to be the tools that I use most often. If I use a tool every day, it is going to be a better quality, typically more expensive tool. So if you liked this video, please hit the subscribe or the like button. If you have suggestions for videos, send them to me and I will try and put them together. I do have a few videos that I am working on. Sometimes I need more specifics in the things that you ask for. So please, if you do submit requests for videos, try and be as specific as you can so that I can understand exactly what it is that you're looking for. Thank you.